Creating and using a database. In this nugget, we're going to start using SQL Server and start really administering our server. We'll start by creating a database, and then we'll review all the various options that you have in a database and talk about what every single one of them does and why you might use them in a production environment. Next, we'll create a table in the database, and I'll show you how to execute a query against that table. Finally, we'll be also looking at how to manage the physical file that the database lives in. Not so much about backing up and restoring it, but just how to deal with the file over its life cycle. So let's dive right in and get started. We're going to open the SQL Management Studio, connect to our server, making sure that we're connecting as an administrator who has the ability to create databases. We'll click on the Databases node here, and you've got a couple options. You can do the old right-click. There's also toolbar buttons up here to create a new database, whatever you need to do, but we're just going to say New Database. The first thing we need to do is give it a name, obviously. So let's shrink this window a little bit so we can actually see everything. Let's name this one My Database. And the owner is the user account who owns the database, and that's a user account that's already set up in SQL Server. Now, in a later nugget, we're going to be talking about SQL Server security, and that's where this owner thing will come in. For right now, leave the owner at the default setting. So the next thing we need to do is decide where we want this database to physically live. There are two files we need to concern ourselves with: the database file and the database log file, the transaction log. The database file needs to live in a file group. If we've created, we can at this point create multiple file groups if we want to, whatever else. Scrolling over a little bit, this is the path for the database file. And then this is the file name. If you don't fill this in, it'll default to mydatabase.mdf and mydatabase.ldf for the log file. Again, in this lab environment, it's okay for me to put all these in one place. In a production environment, you probably never want to have the log on the same disk as the database, and you probably don't want to have either of those on the same machine where SQL servers and the operating system's binary files live. So let's get all that taken care of, and we are going to click Add and add a second file. We're going to call this file My Database 2, and it's also going to live in the primary file group, and we can set a path and file name for it. The initial size is pretty important. Now, when we talk about database options in just a little bit, we'll talk about how SQL Server can make this file bigger if it needs to. In general, though, here's a couple of tricks. Number one, if you know for a fact you're going to have 10 megabytes of data going into this file, make it at least 10 megabytes to begin with. SQL Server will try and grab 10 consecutive megabytes of disk space. Consecutive is important because it allows all the data to live in one contiguous block on disk. In other words, the database file won't be fragmented across the disk. Typically, you should try and make the initial size as big as you think the database is going to need to be. If you know you're eventually going to be using 20 megabytes worth of disk space, well, allocate it now when you can get one good contiguous hunk of database of disk space. So you need at least these two files. I've added a separate one. If I decide I don't want to do that, I can remove it. And then we can look at some of the options we've got to work with. So auto close. By default, SQL Server opens all of its database files automatically as soon as SQL Server starts. That way the file is open, SQL Server can get to it, and it's a little quicker. Auto close says that SQL Server, when it's done using the database file, when there's no more queries being executed, it should close the file. The next time SQL Server needs to use that database, it's going to have to reopen the file, which incurs a little bit of overhead. The benefit of this is that the file, when it's not being used, will be accessible to the operating system, so you can do a simple file level backup, almost a copy and paste. Otherwise, when the file is open, SQL Server does have it locked. Next is auto create statistics. Statistics are used by the database to determine the best way to complete queries. It's things like, this particular index has got this many rows, and this table's got this many rows, and the index is this much out of date, and other stuff like that. Basically, little clues that SQL Server can use to optimize its queries. Generally, auto creating statistics does not take a long time, and it's the best way to work with it. Auto shrink does exactly what it sounds like. Whenever SQL Server is able to shrink the database file, it will. Uh, the only time you're really going to use that is for a database file that doesn't grow very much. Or maybe a bunch of data goes in and then the data gets deleted, and you want to have the database file, the physical files, as small as possible. Auto update statistics is kind of the same as auto create statistics. Create gets them created, update updates them. If you're going to set the one to true, you're probably going to set both to true. Do you want to auto update the statistics asynchronously? Meaning, do you want to kick off an update of statistics and then just let it sort of run in the background? For performance, I'll set that to true a lot. Cursor options are really something that your developers are going to have to tell you about. If you know you've got code on the server that's using cursors, then these need to be set to whatever your database developers expect them to be. The rest of these miscellaneous ones are also really going to affect the way applications run. Leaving them at the default will be SQL Server 2008 compatibility. If you change this, you can change it to SQL Server 2000 or SQL Server 2005. Some of those behaviors will change, if necessary, to match the compatibility, to match what those older versions did. If you've got an application that was specifically designed for SQL Server 2000, setting the database compatibility level to SQL Server 2000 will help avoid issues. Again, though, most of these miscellaneous options are things that your developers are going to have to tell you that they need. Otherwise, I tend to leave them at the default. Probably the only other important ones is this a read-only database? Is encryption enabled? And we are going to be talking about encryption more when we discuss SQL Server's security in an upcoming nugget. And do you want to restrict access? Multi-user means we're not restricting access. Single user means only one user is going to be allowed to connect. Why would you want to do that? Well, maybe for maintenance. If I knew I had a database that I needed to do some maintenance on and I needed to keep everyone out of it while I did that, I might go in and change this option to single user for that period of time. And understand that most of these options here can be changed anytime you need them to. What we're setting now is just going to be their initial state. The other important thing is the recovery model. In an earlier nugget, we talked about how the transaction log works. That is the full recovery model. It means so long as you've got the transaction log intact, you can recover every single thing that's been done to SQL Server all the way back to your last full backup. Bulk logged is slightly different. Certain types of things that you do to SQL Server, certain transactions, are not logged at all. So you do run a risk of actually losing data. And simple means that the transaction log really isn't used for backup and recovery. What that can do, the simple model means you don't have to worry about maintaining your transaction log. You don't have to worry about pulling backups of the database, which results in the transaction log finally being cleared out. Simple says that you take full responsibility. You're not going to worry about the transaction log. The transaction log's not really going to take up any disk space. It's going to be cleared out fairly frequently, but you know that you've got a backup going on frequently enough that you're not going to lose any data, or if you do lose data, that you're okay with it. And again, that's something you can also change later. The collation defaults to the server's default, but the collation is a set of rules for how data is sorted. You establish the default when you install the server, and typically the default will usually be something in one of these Latin. If you need to pick something other than this, it's because your developers are relying on the sort order being something other than what SQL Server usually does. Either your developer or your application vendor is going to have to tell you what to do there. The last section, file groups. Remember in a previous nugget we talked about the fact that you can have multiple files associated with the database, and this is where we set those up. But if you were creating multiple files so that you could spread database objects across disks, you still may need to back up and restore all of those files as a unit in order to have your data be consistent. And that's what a file group lets you do. You can create however many file groups you need, and then you put files into a file group because those files contain data that needs to go together. Let's take an example. I'm going to create another database file again, and we'll call it my data2. And over here on the file groups, I'm going to create a second file group. We'll call it secondary. And I am going to stick my data into secondary. Now at this point, if I do a backup of the primary file group, I'm not getting this file. So if this file if I'm going to put database objects like tables and indexes there that are really connected to here, backing them up separately means they're never going to be in sync with one another. The connected data won't be consistent. It's okay to set this up if you know, for example, that this file is going to contain the majority of say, my customers and their orders. This file is going to contain salesperson bonus information. Not really related to the two, so it's okay if I back them up separately. I'm just going to remove that file before we create this and remove this file group that has nothing in it. Finally, you can add a file stream file. We do have this server enabled for file streams, so I'm just going to call this file streams, and we're going to make it the default for file streams. And now I'll hit OK. Watch the glass spin for just a second, and now it has created my database. If you right-click this and hit Properties, you get a very similar looking screen. Now some of these things, like the database name and so forth, you're not going to change from here, but you can create more files. You can rearrange your file groups. You can change all of those same options. By the way, changing the collation at this point, not always a good idea. If you change the collation, you're going to have to go rebuild all of your indexes. Just something to be aware of. Change tracking. Do we have change tracking turned on for this database? No, but we're going to talk about change tracking later, so I'm not going to turn it on. Permissions, this is where you would set the database permissions. Again, something we'll talk about later. Extended properties, really you're not going to see much of these. These are something developers have to add to the database, so you're not going to mess with it here. Database mirroring is also something we're going to talk about later, and transaction log shipping is something we'll be talking about later. So right now we can close this window, and our database is ready to go. So let's actually start using it. I'm going to open it up. You can see that there's a lot of things that live inside a database, but we're going to go to Tables and right-click to create a new table. I'm a little cramped for space here, so let's rearrange things a little bit. A table consists of more than one column. So let's say I'm going to have a name column, and we're going to make this of the data type nvarchar, and we'll say it can be up to 100 characters long. And I do not ever want it to contain a null value. And we're going to create another one called, let's just say, address. And we'll do the same thing. nvarchar, 100 characters long, and we don't want it to be null. Lots of options and things in here. These are really getting more into database development. The reason we're setting up a table is not to discuss database development, but so that you know how to set up a table. If you were asked to create the table as a SQL administrator, you would need to be given the specifics of what the table is needed to contain, what the column names would have to be, what the data types would have to be, and what all these different column properties would have to be. Those are all things that the developer is going to rely on when they write their application. So we're going to give this a name, my table, and when we're done, we'll hit Save. So I can close this out now. Yes, I do want to save changes. So now we can see over here, DBO, my table. So let's put a little bit of data in there, just so we've got some fun stuff to work with. Let's edit the top 200 rows of the database. Now there's nothing in there now, so hopefully it won't take it too long to pull those out. There they are. Conveniently, I can see the properties of the table over here. I'm going to go ahead and close that just so we can get some more room. And we're going to call this Don, and we're going to say that the address is in Las Vegas. And then we're going to say the next one is Jeff, and he's in Syracuse. And the next one will be Greg, and he'll be in Denver. And the little red there just means that the row hasn't been committed yet, and that it's not ready to be committed because I had a null value over here. But now that I filled it in, we're all good to go. So that's it. That's putting data in. That's not how developers will do it, but if you just need to load a couple pieces of information for a test, then that's how you can manually type it in. So I'm going to close that, and now I'm going to do a new query. Let's take a look at actually executing a query. There's a couple of things you need to do. First of all, make sure before you execute your query that you're pointed to the right database. So we're going to point to my database and execute a simple query that says select all rows from the my table table. You'll notice over here that the table name is listed as dbo.mytable. DBO is the owner, database owner. And that's the default. You're going to see it. And provided everything uses DBO, you don't actually have to refer to DBO. You can see that, let me back up and start typing this again. As I start typing, SQL Server will pop up and help me try and complete. So it says, oh, you're typing a table name. Here's one called my table, and that matches what you've done so far. So let's just hit Tab. To execute this, you click the Execute button. And there's the data that came out of my database. Now I can't actually edit this here. This is a read-only view. If I wanted to change this data, I would update or execute another query. Let's say update my table, and we're going to set name equal to Donald. Oops, single quotes for strings, Donald, where name already equals Don. I'm going to highlight that, and by highlighting and clicking execute, I'll only execute the highlighted query. Okay, so that affected one row. Let's highlight and execute this query, and we can see that it made the change. Now, it's not the purpose of this course to teach you the SQL syntax. As we kind of go along, you'll pick up a couple of examples here and there, and it's good to see it and good to kind of be aware that it's there, but actually using that is a little bit more developerish. If you would like to learn T-SQL, it will certainly help make you a better administrator. Sometimes it's a lot faster just to type a query and execute it than it is to wander through the GUI. I could have done that same thing by saying edit top 200 rows, gone into the table and made my edit there. Sometimes it takes a little longer to do it through the GUI. Most experienced SQL database administrators do know this language. Go pick up a good book on the topic, and again, you'll see some examples as we sort of go through this course. But so what have we done so far? We've created a database. We've looked at the database options. We have created a table and put some data into it. We've looked at how to do a query and how to get some data out and how to view that information once we got those results. So really the only thing that leaves us with is managing that database file. So let's close this query then. Not going to save the changes. I'm going to minimize this, and we're going to go actually look at the database file itself. This was put into C Program Files, Microsoft SQL Server. I believe it's under First Instance here, MS SQL Data, and there it is, My Database and My Database Log. Now I set this up as a 2 megabyte file and set the log up as 1 megabyte, and you can see that's exactly how much space they take up on disk. You and I both know that there's not a full 2 megabytes of data actually floating in there. I've only typed really 3 rows, so there can't be that much. And we need to talk about what happens if I put more data than that in there. What happens when the file gets full? Well, for that we need to go back to the database options. If we look at the files, we can see that this one's set to 2 megabytes, and there's this option called auto growth. Let's take a look at that. We're going to enable auto growth. If this database file fills up, I'm going to make it 1 megabyte bigger. If it fills up again, I'll make it another megabyte bigger, and so forth. And I'm going to allow that to continue unrestricted forever. This isn't a great default setting for most production databases because growing the file takes SQL Server a little bit. When it has to do that, nothing else can really go into the database until SQL Server gets this file made bigger. Probably a better one is to say, well, you know, if we fill it up, let's just go and grow it by a whole, I don't know, maybe 10 megabytes, or maybe grow it by 10%. Something a little bit more practical and production related than just 1 megabyte. You probably want to restrict the file growth. Your maximum file size might be huge, but you never want it to be bigger than the physical disk space it's sitting on. Here's my way of looking at this. Let's say we've got a 500 gigabyte disk, and that's what our database is going to live on. I don't want this to be any bigger than 498. That leaves me with a little room for error. I still have a couple gigabytes left on the disk I could work with. And when the database finally hits this size, it'll stop growing and I'll start getting errors. And I want to get those errors. I can't just let it grow much more than this because there's no disk space. I might even want to know at 400. So at 400 megabytes, I want you to shut down growth and start giving me errors. What that does is it lets me go back in and say, okay, for now you can go to 500 megabytes. And I know that between now and the time you finally hit that 500, I need to go find some more disk space. So by cutting it off earlier, before my disk fills up, it lets me expand that maximum and then take some action to do something about it. Of course, hopefully you're managing and monitoring this all the time, so you won't be caught by surprise like that. The transaction log also supports automatic growth. This one defaults to 2 gigabytes, which is a lot of space, and it will grow by 10%. Keep in mind that if you do a full backup of your database, or if you do a backup of your database, that the transaction log gets emptied out, and all the space it's occupying is available to be reused by new transaction entries. So you should develop a pretty good idea of how big your transaction log is going to be. How much data are you putting into the database? How much are you changing? That's putting transactions into the log, and how much of that's going to occur in between backups. At that point, you can probably set a reasonable size and just leave it there. And the benefit of doing that is that by getting a reasonably sized transaction log in a contiguous set of disk space is faster than the SQL Server has to bop around all over the disk on a fragmented disk to write things into the transaction log and to read them back out again. Now you may come to a time when, let's say you've been allowing your transaction log to grow automatically, but your backups failed for some reason. So your transaction log wasn't getting cleared out. So it's grown to gigantic proportions and it's really taking up a lot of disk space. Well, you've gotten your backup issues under control, so now your backups are occurring regularly. And now you want to make this smaller. How can you control the size of that? Well, one way is to let's go back into the database options. One way down here on options is to enable automatic shrinking. My only problem with automatic shrinking is that takes some time for SQL Server too. And it's something that is going to create a performance impact. It kind of depends on what you're doing with your database server, but it's not something you always want to have sort of going. Or you can sort of come over here and say shrink. Well, let's shrink the database. Let's compact the database within its files so that it takes up as little space as possible within its files. Currently, my database is using 3 megabytes. That's what's allocated to the files. That's 2 for the database file and 1 for the log file. Out of that, 25% of it's not being used. Okay, here's what I want to do. I want to reorganize, which is essentially another way of saying defragment, shrink my database, the data within the file, so that it takes up as little space within the file as possible, leave an extra 10% for future growth, and then I want to actually shrink it. So let's go ahead and do that. And this isn't a big one, so it won't take very long. Let's go look at this file. Let's refresh this. Okay, didn't actually need to shrink the file very much. Sometimes that happens. Let's go back into my database options and say shrink the database. Yeah, you know what? In a new database that's of the minimum size, you're really not going to get much free space out of it. Now you can be a little bit more granular. You don't have to shrink the entire database. You can just choose to shrink particular files. All right, well, which file do I want to shrink? Let's shrink the log. Now that's not in a file group. Here's the file name. Here's where it's located. It's 54% free. Let's release the unused space to the operating system. So let's go ahead and find the OK button here. Go back and actually look and do a little refresh. And did it make it any smaller? No, it didn't. Well, that's kind of because the secret is a megabyte is as small as it's going to get. However, if you had, maybe your backups went wrong and your transaction log wasn't getting cleared out, and now you've fixed that and you want to get the transaction log back down to a reasonable size, that's how you're going to do it. The last database management trick I want to show you is this detaching the database. One way for me to move this database file to another server is to detach it. This will cut off all the connections, so anyone who's connected to the database will be kicked out. It will close the database file and remove it from SQL Server. I can then go into the file system, physically copy the database file to wherever I want it, go into SQL Server on that machine, and there'll be an attach option. And I can attach those database files. So that's one way of moving a database from place to place. And so those are some of the main database management tasks, aside from things like backup and recovery, which we are going to cover in a future nugget. In this nugget, we started administering SQL Server. We started by creating a database, and we reviewed all the options that you have for the database's configuration. We created a table, used SQL's management tools to put some data into it, and then saw how to execute a query. That's definitely a skill you'll use a lot as you work with SQL Server. We also talked about how to manage that database file, how to look at its size, how to shrink it, how to grow it, and why some of the reasons are you might need to do those things. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.